am the director of the Frances McClelland Institute, and we are named after Frances McClelland, and we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of being named in her honor. Frances was a leader in the field of creating opportunities for people who came from disadvantaged or vulnerable backgrounds. She exemplified resilience herself. And really everything we do here at FMI is in the spirit of honoring her legacy to create opportunities for children, youth, and families. The other person we always want to acknowledge is an alum who just won yet another award this morning, Pamela Turbeville. She is a distinguished alum and a real, just all-around supporter, friend of the Norton School, and she established this speaker series. I do want to remind you, this is actually the last talk for this semester, but we do have an exciting lineup coming for the spring. And of course, you can find out all of this by following us on social media. Hopefully, if you're not already a part of our listserv, please sign up. Please also sign up if you've come in, so we can, for accounting purposes, for food. So if you didn't sign when we came in, please sign on your way out. But we hope you follow us to see our other events. And I also want to just give a plug there to some of you in the room. Thank you so much to those of you who helped out with the Vision Awards ceremony that we had on Wednesday. We could not have done it without all of the volunteer effort and Sosie Harvey, our amazing program coordinator, and even people who are no longer directly affiliated with FMI, like Ashley Irving, our past student worker, came back to help volunteer, so thank you to everyone. Last but not least, we are so pleased to have Alyssa Croft join us today. Last spring, when I sent an email out to faculty and students asking for suggestions for people to invite for the speaker series this year, I had several people mention Alyssa. So I'm really pleased that she's joining us today. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology in the Social Psychology program. Next slide, a little bit better. She is the director of the Social Roles and Identity Lab. She's been at the U of A since 2016 after receiving her Ph.D. from the University of British Columbia. And really, Alyssa and I were just chatting. There are a lot of intersections with the work that she does, with the work that's happening here in the Norton School. So we're really excited to learn more about your work today and to really think about how we may be able to build some future collaborations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over.
Well, while she's setting that up, I'll just do my little preamble, which is thank you so much for having me out here. I am really excited to be here presenting our research today, especially because I have been wanting to connect with many of you for a couple of years now, so this is an awesome opportunity. And given that, I'm hoping to try to present kind of a buffet of the research that I've been doing. This is a different sort of talk for me. I opted to stay sort of high level and present a bunch of different things that we've been working on, all under the framework of gender role asymmetry, in efforts to give you all a broader sense of what we've been working on and what we're going to do in the future, and what we're doing right now, in hopes that it will give you an opportunity to try to connect with us. If there's something that you see an area of overlap or connecting interests, I would be thrilled to talk to any of you about that. So, that said, I want to go ahead and start with a quote that I think really nicely sets the stage for the kind of work that I'm going to be talking about today. This is a quote by Gloria Steinem, and she said, "We've begun to raise our daughters more like sons, but few have the courage to raise our sons more like our daughters." And this really nicely captures the spirit in which women's roles and traits and occupations and behaviors and stereotypes are becoming much more flexible over time relative to the degree to which men's roles are becoming flexible or, on the other hand, actually staying quite rigid. And in my broader program of research, I really take this frame of trying to understand gender equality from a very broad perspective. And most research that comes out of social psychology, at least thus far, really focuses on gender equality as kind of a women's problem and doesn't necessarily take into account other pieces of the puzzle that might be contributing to a systemic, broader conceptualization of what gender equality means, what it could look like. And so this idea about masculinity and thinking about men's roles and asymmetrical gender role change is, I think, just one additional little piece of this much larger gender equality puzzle. And so in order to present to you, like I said, an overview, kind of high-level, bird's eye view of the work that we've been working on the last, I'd say, about 8 years or so, I'm going to first set up the problem, just give you some evidence to support this idea that gender roles are changing asymmetrically. I'll talk about our theoretical model that we've developed, as well as some evidence to suggest what some of the potential causes might be for this asymmetry. And then I'll talk about our other work that really dovetails with this to demonstrate why we should actually care about this as a potential problem. And so talking about what are the actual, what's the evidence for the consequences of what this asymmetry can actually do. And then I'll end on maybe a more positive note and talk about some of our really brand new, current, ongoing work, looking at trying to figure out ways that we can create empirical interventions to try to maybe do something about this asymmetry. Again, this is the very, very newest work, so I'm happy to hear your thoughts on that part as well. And before I launch too much into the content, I just want to pause for a second and acknowledge all of my awesome collaborators on this work. This work is definitely a team effort. It's been, like I said, ongoing for nearly a decade now. These people are active and past contributors to the work, as well as our funding sources. And I also want to acknowledge my lab here, and 2 of my grad students are here in the audience, so feel free to introduce yourselves to them as well. They are also participating in this work. Okay, so setting the stage again, we're talking about the degree to which gender roles and stereotypes are changing over time. And since about the time of World War II and the feminist revolution, we've seen that women's roles are really changing to include many more traditional stereotypical conceptualizations of what were more masculine identities, roles, occupations, etc. So women are becoming more agentic, which are things including traits like competence, assertion, being more achievement-oriented, independence, things like that, at a much more rapid rate than men are becoming communal, which is like stereotypical femininity. We're talking about warmth, compassion, being other-oriented, nurturing, things like that that we stereotypically associate with women and femininity. So these kinds of self-definitions are one way that this asymmetry is reflected in the data. And so people are self-stereotyping to an extent that for women is more agentic than in years past. But for men, they're staying about the same level of agency and not increasing in their levels of communion. Another context where we see this asymmetry is in occupational domains. So this is just an overview of some occupational data that we got from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where we show that, so this is, just in the past few decades, all of the slopes of these lines are quite positive and fairly steep. This is the proportion of women entering these previously male-dominated occupational fields. Contrast that with what we see over here, which is the proportion of men who are entering previously female-dominated occupations. So for the most part, the lines are not nearly as steep or flat, or in the case of social workers, actually a steep decline in the proportion of men who have joined this occupation in the last few decades. All right, so setting that into the broader context of, well, why is this happening? Why do we see this asymmetry in role change and self-stereotyping? I've thought a lot about this, and a few years ago put together with my collaborators a theoretical model to try to explain and understand some of the cultural and psychological barriers that might be contributing to men's underrepresentation in more communal roles and occupations. And this is within the context of knowing that there are other fields and other social sciences that are really focusing on this problem, but social psychology in particular hadn't really commented much on this at the time when I was developing these ideas. And so I thought it would be neat to try to apply and integrate some social psychological theories and methodological approaches to trying to further understand this asymmetry. So to give you an overview of the model, I'm not going to go into detail. It's a very long paper. If you want to read it, feel free. I'd love to talk to you about the details. But to keep it high level, we're basically starting with this context of Alice Egley's social role theory and the idea that men and women historically have been divided into separate roles and occupations in society based on what were in our ancestral past necessary and potentially physically restraining factors that came into play. So like physical size and strength, physiological differences between men and women that led them into different roles for child-rearing versus hunting and protection, for example. And so within that broader framework of the existence of gender stereotypes, there is a psychological process whereby people internalize those stereotypes through early socialization processes and through other experiences that they have, where they come to self-identify and start to integrate those self-stereotypes into their sense of who they are and their self-concept. And so these things can create or lead to internal factors like, I don't identify as a communal person, or maybe being more communal isn't as important to my self-concept. And that can prohibit men in particular from engaging in more communal roles and occupations. And importantly, the reason why this isn't just a model of any sort of gender segregation or gender inequality, why this is really about asymmetry and the lack of men in communal roles in particular, is because it's moderated by a status asymmetry. So Cecilia Ridgway has some seminal work talking about the status differential between the things that men and women do and are and value, such that in Western contexts, most of the time, the things that men do, are, and value are more positive or higher status than the things that relatively would be for women. So just to give you one glimpse of a paper that we have that empirically supports this pathway of the theoretical model, I want to just briefly share some data that we collected that we published last year, showing that men have a lower endorsement of communal values. So we measured things like how important it is to them to be other-oriented, more nurturing, how much they want to prioritize their relationships. And we used this information and applied a goal congruity theory framework. So this is based on Amanda Diekman's work that's typically been applied in the area of understanding women's underrepresentation in STEM fields. And we took that and sort of flipped it for our purposes and applied the theoretical model here to test whether these endorsement of communal values would predict men's interest in communal occupations. So here we're talking about female stereotypic or feminine roles, such as being a homemaker, or fields like nursing and social work, ones that you saw from that occupational graph earlier, where men are systematically underrepresented. And again, just to show you some quick data, on the y-axis here we have endorsement of communal values and also career interests. And what you can see is that there is a significant difference between communal value endorsement, so that women are endorsing communal values more than men, and then similarly there is a pattern of career interest whereby men are less interested in communal occupations than are women. And we also have, so we have a few studies to this effect in this paper, and that relationship between gender and career interest is mediated by endorsement of communal values. So it fits within the goal congruity perspective really nicely and illustrates that this is also applicable in that domain. So going back then to the theoretical model, in addition to these internalization and socialization factors, it's also really important to think about external factors, and these are more concrete things that people might face, particularly men might face, even if they do really value communal roles and values. There are some concrete external barriers that might come into play, like social sanctions or social policing. There are actual financial barriers and financial considerations to taking on more communal roles and occupations. And so, again, these things are moderated by the status asymmetry between men's and women's roles and values. But they can also, these external factors can directly feed back into influencing men's self-concepts or directly towards their interest in sort of blocking their interest in these communal roles and occupations. So I want to show you some data from a paper that we published earlier this year that really documents this pathway, the more external barriers pathway. So here, we're looking at people's actual perceptions of gender equality and whether they care to support efforts to enhance gender equality in fields where women are underrepresented versus where men are underrepresented. And so one of the studies in this paper, we did a 2x2 experimental between groups design where we showed people examples of occupations where men or women are underrepresented. And we held constant, we equated the exact degree of underrepresentation numerically. So we had an occupation, say, I don't know, nursing, for example, where women are in the vast majority, and then we would hold that constant with an occupation, say, for example, electrical engineering, where women are in the minority. So we're taking the same numerical proportions and pitting them against each other. We also varied systematically the salary as a way of getting at that status differential moderation. So we controlled status through salary, which is kind of a monetary valuing of status, or at least that was our operationalization of that in this study. And then we asked people, based on these these pie charts that they saw and this information about this occupation, how willing they would be to support programs that were designed to recruit either men or women into this occupation. So here are the results of one of those studies. On the y-axis, it's a bit faded, but what we have here is their support for social action towards change, so recruiting people from the underrepresented group into that occupation. And so what I'll show you here is that there is a significant difference whereby people are much more interested in supporting efforts to recruit women into male-dominated arenas like STEM, for example, compared to recruiting men into female-dominated occupations. And this is true even when the salary level is low. So even when it's particularly undervalued as an occupational role itself. And this just becomes an even stronger difference when it's a high status or high salary occupation. So this discrepancy between wanting to support efforts to recruit women more than men into occupations where they're underrepresented is indeed moderated by status, but it also holds constant, irrelevant to the status differential itself. So, just to recap this quick section of the talk, I've presented a few different cultural and psychological barriers that I've posited could be causes of the gender role asymmetry in change that's happening over time. And for the internalization pathway, I presented some data suggesting that men are less likely to endorse communal values than women, and that can explain their lower interest in communal roles and occupations. And then in terms of the external barrier side, just presenting those data showing that people are actually less willing to support efforts to recruit men into occupations that are female-dominated. So of course there are probably going to be some very concrete, real barriers if efforts were made to try to do that. So that checks off the section of the talk about the causes. Again, very quick, very high-level overview. Happy to talk about details of any of those studies or other work that we have if you're interested. But now I'm going to transition and move on to talking about hopefully making the case for why we should care about this. Why does this actually matter? What are some of the consequences of having this asymmetry in the rate of change for gender role stereotypes? So the short answer to this question is that everyone's affected by gender role asymmetry. At least that's what ours and other people's data have been showing lately. And what I'm going to do now is just go in turn through each of these different groups, men themselves, women, and children, to demonstrate some of our research that supports this idea that we should really care about gender role asymmetry. Okay, so starting with this idea that men themselves are affected by gender role change and the rigid masculinity norms that continue to persist over time while women's roles are becoming more flexible, is just similar to what I mentioned earlier. There are these prescriptions for what men should be like. So they should be these kinds of things, these masculine stereotypic kinds of ways of being, and they should not be. There are proscriptions barring men from being more communal or being seen as behaving in ways that are stereotypically feminine. And this is documented in a wide array of literature from other theorists and other researchers that have shown these things to be true. So given this context in which men are supposed to operate and supposed to not operate, you can see where this would be problematic for men navigating their social lives in their everyday existence. And that's exactly what we find. So in one study that I was lucky to be brought on as a part of, we were investigating this very interesting and perplexing phenomenon called existential isolation. And this is the idea that some people have a subjective experience of feeling fundamentally separate from other human beings. And this sense of existential isolation is different from just a feeling of loneliness. This is a much more deep, kind of perplexing, I mean, it's in the name, right, existential type of feeling where the people who are experiencing this really feel like others in the world just don't get me. I am not connecting with other people, and I'm not part of the rest of humanity. And what's interesting about this is that men systematically report higher scores on existential isolation. And so my collaborators brought me in on this work to try to explore whether a lower endorsement of communal values among men, so this idea that men are socialized to be less other-oriented and less interpersonally connected, might predict this difference in existential isolation, and indeed that's what we found. So if you want to know more about that, happy to chat with you about that later. But building on this work, we're now, we actually just had a paper accepted where we're looking at taking this kernel of an idea, or this thing about men feeling more separate or feeling more isolated from other aspects of humanity, to look at people's grief narratives among a sample of bereaved adults. So these adults had lost someone close to them, either a romantic partner or a child, and they came in for a semi-structured interview in the lab, and we had transcripts of their grief narratives, these interviews that they gave, and we ran them through linguistic analysis program, the Loop program, if you're familiar with it, and we were trying to document whether there were any key linguistic markers that would map onto understanding the psychological functioning and the psychological states of these bereaved adults. And the thing that we found that was really kind of unexpected and kind of particularly interesting and relevant to this talk was that among men, but not women, there was a strong relationship between their use of linguistic non-fluencies, so things like saying or and their distress symptoms, so self-reports of anxiety and depression, complicated grief, not being able to have healthy psychological functioning in the wake of losing someone close to them. So what we take away from this, and this was an unexpected, very exploratory kind of finding, but what we take from this is that it's potentially further evidence that because of how boys and men are socialized early in life to not get a chance to express their feelings and their emotions, to not really talk with other people about how they're feeling, that they don't get as much practice or ability to think through and talk to others about these kinds of experiences, especially something so hard as losing a loved one. And so what that does is it prevents them from being able to make a coherent narrative and to make meaning out of the experience to help them heal and grow in the wake of loss. So I want to also tell you quickly about some of the work that we're currently doing where we're looking at, again, this how rigid masculinity norms are affecting men in particular. And we have a paradigm where we're creating these senses of masculinity threat. So using a precarious manhood framework, there's this idea that masculinity is something that is very tenuous, that can be lost, that needs to be constantly reasserted in the form of manly, macho displays. Otherwise, you could mistakenly be thought of as not masculine or not manly, and that would be kind of the worst thing if you are a man, according to the theory, right? So we've set up an experimental paradigm where we're exposing men to these masculinity threats or not, and then we're looking at how this affects their relationship commitment. So importantly, past research has shown that generally when people are threatened and have a sense of threat to the self, their close relationships and their romantic relationships can actually buffer them against these self-threats. But in the case of masculinity and manhood, we actually hypothesized and have been finding that men withdraw from their relationship partners. So there's this potential source of comfort and this potential buffer, but because of the nature of masculinity as not being seen as weak and not needing to lean on people and not needing social support, we're finding that men are actually showing reduced relationship commitment, they're less invested in their relationships, and they're showing less closeness to their partners. In a parallel set of studies, we're currently, probably right now in fact, collecting data where we're looking at these masculinity threats and the degree to which they have physiological implications for men's experiences of physiological threat versus challenge. So we're using this biopsychosocial model of threat and challenge to try to map men's physiology to these threat experiences, and then using that to predict or maybe see if it mediates men's withdrawal from their relationship partners. So to the degree that men respond to a masculinity threat with a more threat versus challenge physiological profile, does that mean that they're going to withdraw even further from their partner? Versus if men show an index of challenge in response to a masculinity threat, maybe those men would be more likely to stick with their partners and feel comforted by their partners. All right, so switching now to thinking about some work that we've done on how masculinity threats affect women. How are we doing? Oh, okay. So I just want to share with you one paper that I'm particularly proud of because I think it's one of the funnest studies or set of studies that I've done in my career so far. So we're talking about, again, this idea that because gender roles are changing asymmetrically, although women's roles are changing and they're taking on new roles, they're also taking on additional roles. It's not the case that when they take on more workplace responsibilities that they necessarily have less to do at home. Potentially they have maybe even more to do. And that's actually what the research would suggest. So just looking at this headline rather than worrying about all of the subtext there, and I can share these slides with you if you're interested in more of the details. But basically, this is true that women do disproportionately more than men around the house and in the domestic sphere, consistent with gender role asymmetry. And this is even true for couples who are dual earners. So when both parents work full-time outside the home, at the end of the day, this is what researchers have termed the second shift for working moms, because basically at the end of the day, even though both parents maybe have worked the same amount of time outside the home for the day, the wife or mother in the family is typically the one who comes home and does all the cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, the housework. The emotional labor, there's some really great research coming out recently from other people about emotional labor that I would really like to think more about and get into if anybody's interested in that as a topic. And additionally, this is really where I think the asymmetry becomes even more impactful, is thinking about evidence that women, more than men, are likely to say that their family roles at home and the things that they have to do for the second shift, etc., are likely to impact their career trajectories. So women who are dealing with this potential second shift, or even just kind of psychologically anticipating having to deal with a second shift, might be opting out of careers or more involved, potentially leadership types of roles early on, because they're thinking, well, I'm not going to have the time to do all of that if I want to have a healthy, thriving home life at the same time. So taking all of these things into account, we decided to run a study testing whether we could actually manipulate women's perceptions of men's domestic involvement to see if that would actually change their own expectations for their career roles. And so what's really cool about this study, I think, is that we're doing this in a way that relies on people's stereotypes and their potential for who they might become and who they might marry. So these are all single, unmarried women under 25 who are thinking about their future roles and their future self. And can we manipulate that future role self based on what women think men's roles are going to be like? And like I said, this is one of, I think, the funnest studies that I've ever done, because we were able to do a manipulation that I'm very proud of, where we manipulated women's perceptions of men's roles using graphical norm-based information. So this is actually real data. These studies were run in Canada when I was in graduate school, and so basically this is a fact sheet from Statistics Canada that we showed them, and the key thing to look at here is just the slope of this line. So we're basically saying, hey, there's not that many stay-at-home dads. Dads aren't really interested in taking on these roles or helping out much with the domestic stuff. Contrast that with the exact same information, but we've inflated the y-axis. So basically here, this little part is all that's being seen over there. And we reframed it so that here, this percent increase from 4% to 12% of men who are stay-at-home dads now becomes triple the number of stay-at-home dads, which is fully true, right? So what's interesting about this, for many reasons, is that it works. Scary about what it means for interpreting graphs and interpreting data, but the manipulation was effective in a series of 5 studies that we ran. So importantly, our dependent variables in this study were trying to get women to think about their future lives and what kinds of roles they think they would have within that dyadic relationship. So to what extent do they think they're going to be the primary breadwinner, economic provider, or primary caregiver in their future families? And our hypothesis here was that there would be a gender role complementarity effect. So to the extent that men were seen as less traditional, so if men's roles are perceived as changing and men are freeing up some of that time and space for their roles, that women might respond in a complementary fashion and see themselves in less traditional roles as well. And so that is what we found. And I'm going to show you results from an internal meta-analysis that we did across these 5 studies on each of these dependent variables. So I'll orient you to it. So what we have here is basically the summary average estimated effect of this prime of men's roles changing or not changing on women's expectations of becoming the primary breadwinner. And what we see is that when women think that men are becoming more interested in domestic roles and there are more stay-at-home dads, they see themselves more likely to take on a non-traditional breadwinning role in their future relationships. And we actually see the inverse of that when we look at the likelihood of becoming the primary caregiver. So this really maps onto a complementarity kind of framework. So when women think that men's roles are remaining very traditional and men are not interested in taking on caregiving roles, they see themselves remaining in very traditional roles and taking on that caregiving role themselves. So just to summarize what this is showing in words, in case that wasn't super clear, if you've never seen a graph like that before, we're talking about women responding to the roles that they anticipate men will take on. Again, this is all hypothetical, so really there's open questions about whether something like this could actually work, as well as how do we get men to do this, right? So that's a whole other question that I'll maybe get to later. But importantly, what we're seeing is that if we can do something about the asymmetry of gender role change, that could potentially create more opportunities for women to pursue their career goals and potentially to advance into other occupations and leadership roles if their career trajectories are stymied by feeling like they have to take on the second shift and do all the roles in the domestic sphere. All right, last piece of the consequences of asymmetry is talking about some research that we're doing on how asymmetry can affect kids. So here, we're playing with these ideas that parents' division of labor and the potential second shift could really have an impact on what kids see at home and what they internalize. And sort of going back to our theoretical model, it might have a pretty strong impact on what they think they can do in the future. So pairing that with existing research showing that parents' careers or parents' occupations do systematically predict the career ambitions of their kids, we thought, well, what happens when parents go to work? In a kid's world, parents are just gone, right? But when they're doing things at home and they're dividing the labor in a very traditional gendered stereotypic way, kids are really seeing that. And so to what extent does parental division of labor link to kids' career aspirations in the future? So this is a study that we published several years ago where we looked at this question. And we had actually two sort of competing ideas about what might happen in this case. On the one hand, we thought, well, maybe parents would be sort of function as gender-matched role models for their kids. So maybe boys would sort of model what their dads do, and girls would model what their mothers do. On the other hand, again, given Cecilia Ridgway's work on status value asymmetry, it might be the case that dads in these were cohabiting heterosexual families that we recruited to participate in this study. So it might be that dads, as the sort of higher status gender parent, could serve as the model for kids regardless of their gender. So to test this idea, we recruited a sample of almost 700 people. So this was over 300 kids and at least one of their parents. And then we asked parents to tell us about their division of labor at home. So basically we had a continuous measure of percentage and said basically what proportion of the child care and housework do you do? Not what does your partner do, just what do you do? And what we found, consistent with all the existing literature that I've been showing you today, was a stark discrepancy between domestic contributions for moms versus dads. So moms were reporting doing about twice as much of the household labor as dads were. And then when we actually looked at just the families where both parents work full-time, there was still a significant difference between moms and dads' domestic contribution, although it was the difference was a bit smaller. So we're using that information to predict for kids, what is it that you want to be when you grow up? And so we took these open-ended responses from kids, and these are grade school age kids, so 6 to max 12, I think. And we coded their responses for gender stereotypicality, so how stereotypically feminine to stereotypically masculine. And to make these codings, we used actual numerical data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so the proportion of men and women that are in these occupations made them coded as male and female stereotypic. So this is just one of the findings from this paper. There are a bunch more things that I think are really interesting, but most relevant to this talk, I want to highlight this finding for us. So on the y-axis, we have the gender stereotypicality of their occupation, where a score of 2 in this case would represent gender neutral. So this is not necessarily more masculine or more feminine. And then higher scores are going to be more stereotypic. Lower scores, less stereotypic. No one's going to be below that gender neutral line. I'll just tell you that right now. So when we look at how parents' division of labor, and particularly this is for fathers' domestic contribution. So this is the set of the sample where we had father data. And for mothers, this pattern did not emerge. So this only comes out when we look at dad data. For boys, there is nothing going on. Boys are at ceiling of stereotypicality, and there is very little variability at all for us even to be able to predict anything from parents' behaviors. But what we did see for girls was that when their dads did more around the house, so were less gender traditional, their daughters got closer to approximating or thinking about career aspirations that were more gender neutral. So the reverse of that is also true, right? So when dads said that they did less around the house, so they were much more gender traditional, their daughters reported more rigid, more stereotypic, feminine kinds of occupational aspirations. So, taking that into account, another thing that we were really interested in thinking about, and this is some of our current ongoing work, is wondering whether this asymmetry in gender role change is just something that sort of seeps into how kids internalize and think about themselves, or is it something that's maybe a little bit more active? Like, does it change how people parent or how they want to raise their kids? And I found this really interesting graphic that essentially is showing support for people saying that they would let their kids play with non-gender toys or opposite gender toys, right? So what I think is also really interesting about this is that even though there's sort of overwhelming support for saying, yeah, I let my kid play with a toy that isn't for their gender role, there is actually 1/3 of people who are saying, no way. There's no way I would let my boy play with girl toys. But there's only about 1/4 of people who are saying that they would not let their daughters play with boy toys. So I take this as even further continuing evidence of the asymmetry, right? So girls are much more seen as able to play with things that are not for girls than boys are, where they have to adhere more to playing with boy-related toys. So what we're doing in this line of work is we're actually investigating whether this asymmetry or people's ideas about what boys and girls should and shouldn't do maps onto their preferences for masculine and feminine traits in their kids. So we have a sample, actually we have 2 samples now, of college students who we're asking them to imagine their ideal hypothetical child. And what we're actually finding, which we didn't expect, is that both men and women in these samples prefer children who are more masculine than feminine for both sons and daughters. So there just seems to be a general preference for masculine traits over feminine traits. Again, really interesting, very new, unpublished data we're currently replicating to see if we can make sense of these patterns and see if they're reliable in a second sample. All right, so that goes over some of the consequences and ways in which everyone, men, women, kids, seem to be affected by gender role asymmetry. Hopefully I've convinced you that this is actually something maybe worth caring about. And now I want to move on to talking about some of the more hopefully happier note kinds of research that we're doing to try to understand ways that we might mitigate some of these negative consequences for gender role asymmetry. So basically, in this work, we're moving on to a new context where we're looking at how pro-social behavior or helping might actually be a really special, unique arena for trying to get people to try to do things that are counter-stereotypic to their gender role. This is because helping is, even though being pro-social and being communal overall is more of a feminine stereotypic or female stereotypic trait or way of being, it's still seen very positively. It's still highly valued in most Western societies. And so even though it's stereotypic for women, it has higher value than maybe some of the other traits and roles that women might do or occupy. Within helping, as like a context, there's another really interesting discrepancy, and that is that there are gendered types of helping. So there are ways that you can help that are more masculine or more feminine. So even though overall research finds that men and women help with the same frequency, they do so very differently. So here we have men engaging in more agentic types of helping, which is typically physical-based, higher risk, problem-solving types of behaviors, and generally it's kind of a short-term investment type of pro-social behavior. For women, on the other hand, they're of course doing, surprise, stereotypically, feminine kinds of helping. So providing emotional support, caring for other people, nurturing people, and these are often things that are much longer term kinds of commitments. So they're requiring a lot more time and investment from women. So even though, again, same frequency of helping, women are technically doing a lot more of this kind of pro-social labor. So we wondered what we might be able to do with this framework to try to get people maybe outside of their comfort zones and intervene to see if we could actually get people to help in cross-gendered ways. And the way that we're doing this is by taking the theory of planned behavior, which is a theoretical model that comes out of health psychology, typically used to look at things like how do we get people to behave in healthy ways and avoid behaving in unhealthy ways. And we're sort of mashing that up with social role theory to try to see can we create a testable integrated framework where we derive actual concrete interventions that we can then test to see if we could get people to help in non-gendered ways and what that might do. Like, does that actually, is that rewarding, or do people really dislike doing that? Our hypothesis is that it's rewarding. We haven't yet tested that, though. Okay, so this is a very overwhelming model, but I'm going to break it down for you in piece by piece. This is basically the mashup model of the theory of planned behavior with social role theory. So here we're talking about starting again with the context of gender stereotypes and gendered helping expectations. There are three key factors, according to the theory of planned behavior, that should predict individual level engagement in these helping behaviors. So, the attitude towards the behavior. How do I think this is going to make me feel? Do I have a positive or negative attitude towards it? Do I think it's good or bad to help? That's the attitude component. The second component is subjective norms. So this is like, how much do I think other people are going to judge me? Or do I feel like I'm going to face backlash if I deviate from traditional gender roles in order to help in a way that's inconsistent with my stereotyped gender role? And then the third thing is basically a sense of self-efficacy. This is like, to what extent do I feel that I have the skills or qualifications or training or experience necessary to actually help somebody? Like, maybe if someone needs their car jump started, I don't actually know how to do that, right? But I could Google it. We all have phones, right? So my argument is that even though it might seem like these kinds of helping are really restricted to skills or qualifications, often we're not talking about things that are biologically restricted, if that makes sense. Okay, so all of these factors then together should predict my intentions to want to help someone. How likely do I think it would be if I encountered this situation that I would help? And then that should go back and predict my actual behavior. So do I help or not? And all of this is framed within the context of social role theory, such that as long as we continue seeing men helping in masculine ways and women helping in feminine ways, we're going to assume that to help in a feminine way you need to be a woman, and to help in a masculine way you need to be a man. That's going to self-perpetuate the cycle and reinforce those stereotypes over time. So we have 4 studies so far that have tested this theoretical model, and I'm just going to show you the results of one of them. Again, it's kind of an overwhelming slide, but really all it is this model with data attached to it. So we tested this, and we created a set of masculine and feminine helping behaviors that we derived based on pilot testing. And these were the top 5 masculine and least feminine behaviors that people could do to help. and these were the top 5 feminine, least masculine behaviors that people could do to help. So this, we started with a list of 25 that we generated based on existing literature, and then these were the ones that popped for the masculine and feminine helping. So in the data I'm going to show you on the next slide, we basically asked people to imagine what they think would happen if they were in a context where they were engaging in either one of the feminine types of helping or one of the masculine types of helping. And we created condition variables so that for women doing feminine helping and for men doing masculine helping, that was a gender consistent condition. And then for women imagining doing masculine helping and men imagining doing feminine helping, that was a gender inconsistent condition. Does that make sense? Okay, so then they read about this scenario. They said what their attitudes were towards that kind of helping, what their subjective norms were, so how much do they think other people would approve of them doing this, and their perceived behavioral control, which is basically how much efficacy did they feel they had to help in this way. And then they reported their intentions to help. Then 1 month later, we followed up with them and we asked them how much they had helped in a stereotypic or non-stereotypic or consistent or inconsistent way over the past month. So we were able to predict not actual behavior yet, we're working towards that, but getting closer by predicting recalled behavior, which is consistent with or follows some of the existing theory of planned behavior paradigms that they use. So basically the takeaway from this is that the model is supported. There are some interesting peculiarities that I'd love to discuss with any of you at some point if you're interested in this or if you know about SEM data of this nature. This is our first time creating a model like this, so I'm happy to talk it through or get feedback from people. But the takeaway message is that there is significant pathways from conditions, so gender stereotypic or consistent, with counter stereotypic or inconsistent. So people who were imagining doing something that's inconsistent with their gender role had less positive attitudes, less positive subjective norms, so more restrictive subjective norms, and less self-efficacy towards doing that. Those things all predicted their behavioral intentions, so they were less likely to say that they would engage in the behavior, and when they recalled the behavior, the frequency with which they had done those kinds of helping within the last month, it mapped onto their attitudes, norms, and perceived behavioral control. All right, so all of this is really encouraging. We're working right now on putting together a registered report submission where we're designing an actual behavioral lab study to try to put this in action in real life. Turns out it's really hard to come up with a paradigm that will get people to help. So my student Hannah has really been instrumental in designing a paradigm where we can look at degrees of helping. So at what point do they help, and we can get a more continuous measure of helping rather than a dichotomous helping, not helping. But this is all work that's currently in process, so I'd love to talk with you more about that as well. All right, so in summary, I think we should really care about this thing that is asymmetry in gender role change. And I want to just finish with a few broad takeaway conclusions. So first is that hopefully I've convinced you that this is a real thing, it's really happening, and that if we want to really understand gender equality, we're going to have to start thinking about the broader puzzle and the different pieces that make up gender equality that may or may not be the way that we've always done it, or the way that we've always thought about it. And then just the evidence of why it matters, and that is the consequences that men, women, children are either all directly or indirectly affected by these asymmetric rates of change. And that in the future, I want to say we could do more to encourage both men and women to overcome traditional gender role stereotypes that restrict their behavior. And potentially, by doing this within the context of pro-social behavior, we'll be able to make a model for how this looks and what interventions we could do, and then expand that out into other domains. All right, thank you so much for your time, and here's my contact info, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay,
Yeah.
looking at my own family, and I see that whatever the oldest child does, like if you focus on the oldest child, everybody else follows, because kids, and so if you have a son, right, and I'm an electrical engineer, and he wants to follow right into it, and he does that. The daughter, no problem, she goes right into it, and even though she's like the only person in her class that's, you know, when she was in school and all that, and even while she's working, she's like the only engineer, she does it, and the other kids all do the same thing, so, but if the child, I notice in other families, if the male child, or whoever the first child is, goes into something that's sort of like feminine-ish, not exactly, but you know, an occupation that's not really male-oriented, like, let's say military, he goes into military, everybody else wants to do that, that they see that as the root. So I think it's not just what the parents do, but it's what the oldest child, like focusing on the oldest child has a big impact, I'm thinking. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah, and I feel like I've come across some literature that has tried to look at this in a much more sophisticated way, kind of looking at family dynamics and birth order, but that's not the right word, right? Do you know about this literature?
Well, I mean, there's definitely developmental work on birth order and siblings, but I don't know about the experiment.
But not like birth order stereotypes, like that's, I think those are books, right?
Yeah.
No, but this is like, you know, there's evidence that like having a daughter or son first can change people's own levels of traditional or egalitarian gender role attitudes. And then I'm thinking about whether there was a paper on like what you're saying, sibling kind of path paving.
See, I'm even thinking things like, you know, we would watch NASA, okay, we're really interested in it. So of course my sister wants to be an astronaut too. She didn't think anything of it because that's what I wanted to do, you know what I mean? So
it's an interesting empirical question because like anecdotally in my family, we're all very different. Like whatever my sister did, I wanted nothing to do with, and my younger sister wanted nothing to do with what I was doing. So I feel like there's a moderator there of like, I don't know, independent or something, but it's an empirical question that I think there might be some data out there to speak to it, but I'd have to look into it more and get back to you, which is cool because I'm here, so it's not hard to do. Yeah.
This kind of maybe help maybe explain why your family and others are like that. Has there been research about the influence of a peer group? Like if somebody...
Totally. Yeah. I mean, just generally in developmental work, like early peer experiences, and particularly around gender socialization, can have profound impact on kids' self-stereotyping.
I wonder if a liberal family that, or but a family with more egalitarian social role dynamics within the
like the parents
move into a really conservative neighborhood or part of the country. And so the kids are kind of faced with this conflict of, you know, are they more influenced by their social group or their parents?
Yeah.
And what would kind of...
That would be such a cool study to do. I think that's a really interesting idea. And I would love to do more about, and frankly, I'm not qualified to do this, so if any of you are like thinking about more contextual, like actual demographic or neighborhood or community-related factors, and how those predict familial type factors, and then even, you know, within families, the relationships between family members, and then looking at like the unique contributions of each of those different predictors. I think that would be awesome. I have no idea how to do it, but I'm down. Yeah.
I do gender equity work in the schools, and I'm a little nervous about dominating this, so if you're willing to hang afterwards, maybe this would be better, but I have some questions and some comments. My question is, I'm fascinated by why when men are threatened, they would pull away from their primary relationship, if you have any information on that. The other thing that I'm curious about is, my hunch is, in the past anyhow, one of the things that has kept traditional gender roles in place is homophobia. And I'm curious, especially for men, when men do feminine things, they're much more likely to be put down homophobically than women are. And I'm just curious if there's been any research on how gay marriage and gay stuff coming out has changed that, if at all. The other thing that I'm curious about is as transgender and gender fluidity is coming out,
Yeah,
if-
none of that's incorporated in this work.
if that's having any impact on how rigid, I don't know, those are just some comments and curiosities that I have.
I can think of data. I can think of data to at least approach all three of those things. So the first question was about why would men pull away from their relationship partners in the face of masculinity threats, and we were fascinated by this as well. We have some initial data, I think 2 studies at this point, where we're measuring people's perceptions of men's masculinity and femininity based on how kind of dependency oriented they are towards their partner. And what we're finding is that men who are more nurturing or more invested in their relationship or more dependency oriented are perceived as less masculine than men who are more aloof or more independent or more perceived as more separate from their partner. So potentially there's something to this strategy as a way to restore masculinity by withdrawing from your partner, although I hesitate to say that yet, but
Yeah.
that's sort of what we're looking at now. Can we come back to the other questions and take some?
Yeah,
Okay,
for sure,
cool,
absolutely.
Because I have
Yeah,
lots
yeah.
of thoughts about these are great, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question on your definitions because this is not an area I study, so this is layman's terms. But when you look at compassion, when you look at like emotional support, and there's probably assumption that that somehow involves people. My view is that my father was traditionally that way, but he was compassionate, he was emotionally involved with all of our animals. And so his, if you looked at the comments and you related it on people, I don't know, already within that, if you put that other variable now that we're going to have a vet school, I'm wondering if some of those roles get crossed when there's an animal there. Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Anyway, that's just my...
Do people know the gender distribution of veterinarians? Are there more women who are vets than men? That would be my stereotypic assumption because it is more of a compassion-based occupation. But I don't actually know of any work differentiating between treatment of animals versus treatment of people. Like, usually the distinctions are like people things kinds of distinctions, like the classic sort of gender
internet of all the
stereotyping.
guys with their dogs. Seriously, there's something there.
Yeah,
joke.
yeah. No, I mean, it's an interesting, I mean, it might be another context in which we can start to break down some of the gender boundaries in a more acceptable way that's like maybe more palatable to people as like a gateway towards trying to affect larger scale change. That's a cool idea. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, thank you.
My cat, so...
Any other questions? Well, if there aren't, maybe I'll just return to your second
Or we
point.
can do it if people want to leave, whatever.
Yeah,
But-
I'm good with whatever.
Yeah, tell us your thoughts.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where I saw a really interesting talk, and this paper just came out too. So if you're interested in it, I can send you the like preprint or maybe the actual print. I'm not sure. But are you all familiar with Project Implicit? It's this like big database of online measures of implicit bias. I use air quotes because there's a lot of, it's contentious in the literature and also in the public about what these kinds of things are measuring, but really what they're assessing is kind of semantic association, so how quickly people categorize different stimuli as a way of indexing stereotypes or strength of association between stereotypic concepts. So the interpretation is that the faster you are to pair a stimulus with a stereotyped group, the more bias you have. So this is the premise of this work. So this website has been in existence for I think 20 years now. I think it was 1999 that it first launched. And so they have awesome amounts of data, and I mean like millions and millions of data points across these 20 years, and they're just now starting to do things like looking at change over time in implicit stereotypes and implicit biases based on these epic data sets. And this talk that I saw was looking at how much is like regional, was it regional bias? Or it was something about, there was a contextual variable that they had that was maybe regional levels of like incorporating legality of same-sex marriage or something like that. Like, I can't remember exactly what the unit of measure was, but it was basically an index of whether or not places had over time legalized same-sex marriage. And what they find is a actual steep decrease in implicit anti-gay bias in these regions. So it maps onto over time and also for legalizing, so sort of systematically endorsing same-sex marriage. So there does seem to be some evidence that yes, these things are changing over time, and they might be tied to broader demographic changes that are happening in society. And more papers like this are coming out as they analyze those backlog data sets. It's really cool stuff. Yeah.
Another thing is income.
Yes.
If you come from a relatively poor, say, blue-collar family,
Mm-hmm.
the one person, let's say the kids that makes it and becomes professional and becomes successful, that has a real big influence. Whereas if you come from let's say a wealthy family, everybody's kind of so really nobody has an influence, because you see everybody succeeding. So
right.
well, it's not just expectation, but the career you choose, you're going to be successful in whatever. So it doesn't really have a difference. Whereas the poor, I'm thinking they really don't. I'm thinking my own family too. You don't know how to succeed really, and then when you see someone succeed, you follow it. You're more likely to follow. Whereas if everybody's succeeding, so there's no reason to follow. You can choose your gender roles that you traditionally do, and you'll still be successful.
Yeah.
Whereas, and that would matter. Like even if it's a female who's the oldest child, and she's successful, the man might want to go. You know what I mean? He's going to say that's the career to choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm reminded of Bujur Dasgupta's work. So she was here last year and gave a colloquium for us in the psychology department, but her work is fascinating, and she does a bunch of stuff on role models, and she has this theoretical perspective on what she calls stereotype inoculation. And it's basically her philosophy or her theoretical perspective is that seeing other people like you in certain roles can serve as like a social vaccine. So it inoculates you against this feeling that you don't belong there because, oh, there is a representation of someone who is like me, and that means maybe I could also try to dip my toe in that water, or I could see how it goes for me because other people like me can survive in this context. And so I think that was the first thought that came to mind for me about, representation and belonging and having role models as a super important precursor to people branching out and trying new things and trying roles and occupations where their group has traditionally been underrepresented. I hadn't really thought of it like in terms of families, though. I think that's a new idea to me that I'm interested in grappling with and thinking more about, because usually the work on role models, and so we are starting some new work actually right now that we're going to try here at U of A looking at role models and stereotype inoculation. But it's usually with like in-group experts or peer mentors or things like that. I don't know of any literature that's looked at like siblings, for example, as role models in the context of this stereotype inoculation. So that could be super cool. But I would definitely think more about